For centuries, people have repeated stories about the Middle Ages as if they were absolute truth. We are told that everyone believed the world was flat, that knights clanked around in impossibly heavy armor, that peasants lived their entire lives in mud and misery, and that medieval medicine was nothing more than superstition. These tales sound vivid, dramatic, and easy to remember. But here's the secret. Most of them are not true. They are myths created later, exaggerated over time, and repeated so often that we accept them without question. Welcome to Boring History. For Sleep, where we travel calmly through the past, uncovering the details you may never have heard before. Tonight we are not chasing legends, but clearing them away. We will take those facts you've always believed about the Middle Ages and reveal the reality behind them. And while we do so, we'll move slowly, carefully, and steadily so that you can listen, relax, and if you like, drift into rest. Before we begin, take a moment to gently press the like button and subscribe so you can always return to these long, quiet journeys into history. So settle back, get comfortable, and let us start untangling the biggest medieval lies everyone still thinks are true. When people today imagine the Middle Ages, one of the first ideas that often comes to mind is the notion that everyone believed the earth was flat. Teachers, textbooks, and popular stories have repeated it so often that it has become almost unquestioned. Truth. The image is simple. Medieval peasants looking across the horizon, convinced that ships would tumble over the edge if they sailed too far. Scholars warning that explorers risked plunging into an abyss if they dared to leave the known world. It is a dramatic picture, easy to remember, easy to tell. But like many things that are dramatic and easy, it is also false. The people of the Middle Ages did not believe the earth was flat. In fact, they knew it was round, just as people had known since the days of ancient Greece. The myth of the flat earth belongs not to the Middle Ages, but to the centuries that came after. If you pause to think about it, the idea makes little sense. Anyone who had ever watched a ship sail out to sea could see that its hull disappeared before its mast. Anyone who had looked at the curved shadow of the earth on the moon during an eclipse could tell that it was round. These observations were not hidden, nor were they beyond the understanding of medieval scholars. In fact, from the early centuries of learning, European thinkers were taught the works of ancient writers like Aristotle, who had clearly argued that the earth was a sphere. Their writings, copied in manuscripts and studied in schools, were available throughout the Middle Ages. Far from denying them, medieval scholars repeated them, taught them, and used them to explain the natural world. The real reason we so often hear that medieval people believed in a flat earth has less to do with the Middle Ages themselves and more to do with later centuries. In the 19th century, when writers wanted to emphasize how much more enlightened modern science was compared to the dark Middle Ages, they began to invent and exaggerate stories. By portraying medieval people as simple, superstitious, and ignorant, they could make their own age appear more advanced. The myth of the flat earth was one of their most effective tools. It created a neat contrast. Before modern science, people supposedly believed absurd things, and only with progress did the truth emerge. But in reality, the truth had been known long before Dot in medieval schools. Students studied works like the Sphere by John of Sacrobosco, a 13th century textbook that explained the roundness of the earth. This little book was copied for centuries, used by teachers, and read by anyone pursuing the basics of astronomy. In its pages, Sacrobosco described how the Earth's spherical shape explained natural phenomena, such as why stars visible in one region were hidden in another, and why ships vanished hull first over the horizon. Far from being an exotic idea, the round Earth was ordinary knowledge, part of basic education. Even among ordinary people, the idea of a flat Earth would not have made sense. Travelers, sailors, and merchants who moved between distant regions of the known world saw evidence every day of a curved globe. When a caravan crossed long distances, or when sailors navigated by stars that shifted as they moved north or south, they observed differences that only made sense on a sphere. Practical experience confirmed what scholars already knew. One of the most famous stories used to illustrate the supposed flat Earth belief is the voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492. According to the myth, Columbus struggled to convince skeptical advisors that the world was round and that he could reach Asia by sailing west. But this story, too, is misleading. Columbus's contemporaries already knew the Earth was round. The debate was not about its shape, but its size. Some believed the distance across the Atlantic to Asia was far greater than Columbus estimated. And in this they were right. Columbus was not correcting people's flat Earth ideas. He was gambling that Asia lay closer than most believed. His success came not from proving the Earth was round, but from encountering a continent Europeans had not expected to find in their path. Why, then, do we still hold on to the flat Earth myth? Part of it is that it makes for a good story. It flatters modern listeners by suggesting we are smarter than our ancestors. It gives the Middle Ages a sense of being dark and backward, which contrasts nicely with the idea of the Renaissance and Enlightenment that followed. It is easier to tell children that medieval people thought ships would fall off the edge than to explain the more complicated truth that knowledge existed, but that distances and geography were still debated. The myth survives because it is simple, dramatic, and convenient. But if we listen closely to the voices of the Middle Ages themselves, we hear a different story. We find scholars carefully measuring the height of the sun at different times of year, using shadows and angles to calculate the Earth's circumference. We find sailors navigating by curved horizons, predicting landfall by watching how the stars shift. We find manuscripts filled with diagrams of a globe, lines of latitude and longitude sketched across it. None of these fit the picture of a flat Earth. Leonardo da Vinci himself, living at the end of the Middle Ages, filled his notebooks with drawings of the Earth, the moon, and the sun, all spherical, all part of a vast, balanced cosmos. To him and to his contemporaries, the round Earth was no mystery. It was simply the foundation on which the rest of their observations rested. So when we hear that medieval people believed the world was flat, we are not hearing their truth but our myth. We are repeating a story invented centuries later, shaped by the needs of writers who wanted to cast the past as ignorant and the present as enlightened. The real Middle Ages, as always, were more complex, more thoughtful, and more connected to observation than we often imagine. It is easy, in modern times, to smile at the supposed ignorance of those who came before. But perhaps it is wiser to pause to ask where these stories came from, and to remember that the past is never as simple as the myths we inherit. The people of the Middle Ages looked at the same stars, the same horizons, the same eclipses that we do, and they understood much more than we often give them credit for. The flat earth that never was is a reminder not of their ignorance, but of our willingness to believe a convenient tale. When modern people imagine a medieval knight, the image that often comes first is of a figure encased in iron from head to toe, lumbering under the weight of his armor. Popular films, cartoons, and even school books have shown warriors so weighed down that they could scarcely climb onto a horse, and if they fell to the ground, they supposedly had to be hoisted back up with ropes or lifted by helpers. The picture is vivid. Knights trapped in their own protection, clumsy and awkward, moving like walking coffins rather than skilled fighters. It is a dramatic story and completely untrue. The truth about medieval armor is far more interesting. Far from being impossibly heavy or crippling, a full suit of plate armor was a remarkable feat of design, balancing protection with mobility. A well-made suit did not turn a knight into a prisoner of metal, but into a highly mobile, resilient soldier capable of fighting, running, climbing, and even vaulting into the saddle without aid. The myth of the helpless knight weighed down by Stundundai. Steel comes not from the Middle Ages, but from misunderstandings centuries later. To begin, let us consider the actual weight. A full suit of late medieval plate armor, the kind worn in the 5th, 10th, and early 16th centuries, usually weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, 18 to 27 kilograms. This may sound heavy, but distributed across the entire body, it was far less burdensome than it seems. For comparison, modern soldiers often carry gear and equipment that weigh as much or more, including packs, weapons, and supplies. Yet no one imagines that modern soldiers cannot move. Knights, too, trained from youth to wear and fight in armor, developed a strength and stamina to handle it with ease. Design was the key. Armorers shaped plates to fit the body, allowing joints to bend and twist. Articulated sections at the elbows, knees, and shoulders meant that knights could swing swords, raise shields, aim lances, and ride horses naturally. The plates overlapped like scales, giving protection while maintaining flexibility. Far from being stiff boxes of iron, suits of armor were masterpieces of engineering, tailored to the individual wearer like a second skin of metal. Evidence from the period confirms this. Accounts of tournaments describe knights running, leaping, and wrestling in armor. Illustrations show men climbing ladders, storming castles, and engaging in hand-to-hand combat without difficulty. Surviving suits of armor in museums often display dents and scratches from battle, proof that they were not ceremonial costumes but functional equipment tested in real combat. Modern experiments with trained reenactors wearing authentic reproductions show that knights could sprint, somersault, and even perform cartwheels in armor. They were not immobilized. They were formidable. The myth of overly heavy armor likely arose from several sources. One is the confusion between real battle armor and specialized tournament armor. In the later Middle Ages, as jousting became a popular sport, some suits were indeed built heavier, designed for maximum protection in the controlled setting of the tilt yard. These could weigh far more than battle armor and were not intended for mobility on a battlefield. Over time, Observers who saw these cumbersome tournament suits may have assumed that all armor was like this. Another source of the myth comes from the centuries after the Middle Ages. As firearms advanced and armor became obsolete, old suits were displayed in collections or museums, sometimes stripped of their context. By then, people had forgotten how armor was used and imagined it as awkward and impractical. Writers in the 18th and 19th centuries, eager to contrast their own enlightened age with what they saw as a clumsy past, exaggerated the idea. They spread the story of knights being hoisted onto horses or helpless when fallen, not realizing that these tales misrepresented the truth. Practical experience offers the clearest rebuttal. Knights trained constantly, beginning as boys in the households of nobles, serving first as pages, then as squires, and finally as fully armed warriors. From a young age, they learned to ride, to fence, to wrestle, and to handle weapons. Wearing armor was simply part of their daily routine. By the time they reached knighthood, they were not only skilled fighters, but athletes conditioned to move in metal as if it were ordinary clothing. Accounts from chroniclers describe knights charging across battlefields, engaging in duels, and performing feats of endurance that would be impossible if they were trapped in immovable shells. Armor was also adapted to the tasks at hand. A knight on horseback wore certain pieces optimized for mounted combat, while a foot soldier might carry lighter protection for mobility. Helmets, gauntlets, and breastplates came in different forms, designed to balance defense with comfort. Far from being uniform, armor was a flexible technology, customized for role, wealth, and purpose. The myth of the one-size-fits-all iron prison ignores this complexity. It is worth noting, too, that armor was not simply iron or steel slapped onto a body. It was carefully crafted, shaped by master armorers who understood both metal and movement. Each suit was fitted to its owner, measured to ensure that joints aligned and weight was balanced. Wealthy knights often had multiple suits for different occasions: battle, jousts, parades, each tailored like fine clothing. To wear armor was not to be encumbered, but to carry a work of art designed for survival. The endurance of the myth, like so many medieval falsehoods, reveals more about later centuries than about the Middle Ages themselves. To imagine knights trapped in their armor is to imagine the past as clumsy and unsophisticated. Yet the truth shows the opposite. Medieval armorers were engineers of the highest skill, creating technology that balanced form and function, protection and freedom. In reality, a knight in armor was not a stumbling relic, but a symbol of discipline, wealth, and strength. His suit was a visible marker of his training, his resources, and his readiness for battle. To face such a figure on the battlefield was not to see a helpless man, imprisoned in steel, but a mobile, resilient fighter whose body had been transformed into a weapon in its own right. So the next time we picture a knight rolling helplessly on his back like a turtle or dangling in the air as squires lift him onto a horse, we should remember that image is not history, but fantasy, a story told later to mock the past. The truth is that knights were among the most athletic soldiers of their age, and their armor was a marvel of design that gave them both protection and power. The myth of the armor too heavy to move belongs to the world of legend, not the reality of the Middle Ages. When people today picture medieval peasants, the image is often unchanging. ragged figures bent beneath the weight of sacks, living in filthy huts of straw and mud, never washing, never smiling, their lives little more than endless misery. In films and illustrations, they shuffle through mud-covered villages, their clothing in tatters, their homes barely distinguishable from animal pens. The impression is of a population barely above survival, locked in dirt and despair for centuries, until modernity finally rescued them. Like many of the stories we tell about the Middle Ages, this picture is simple, dramatic, and easy to remember. But it is also misleading. Medieval peasants lived hard lives, to be sure, but they were not hopelessly filthy or endlessly miserable. Their existence was more complex, more balanced, and in many ways far richer than the myths suggest. The idea that peasants wallowed in constant mud comes largely from later stereotypes. As cities grew in the 19th century, urban commentators often looked back at rural life with disdain, portraying it as dirty and primitive compared to industrial progress. Writers exaggerated the hardships of medieval farming to emphasize how far society had advanced. Over time, these exaggerations hardened into cliches. Yet if we step into the reality of a medieval village, we find people who valued order, cleanliness, and community, who maintained their homes with care, and who found meaning in a rhythm of life closely tied to the land. Houses in medieval villages varied, but they were rarely the collapsing hovels of imagination. In wealthier regions, peasants built timber-framed homes with wattle and daub walls, thatched or wooden roofs, and separate spaces for cooking and sleeping. Even simpler cottages, constructed of clay and wood, were carefully maintained. Floors were swept, hearths tended, roofs patched. Families repaired their homes season by season, taking pride in what little they had. Archaeological studies of village remains show evidence of orderly layouts, with lanes, wells, and communal spaces. These were not random heaps of mud, but structured communities. Cleanliness, too, mattered more than the myth allows. Medieval people washed more than we think. Streams, rivers, and wells provided water for bathing and laundry. Public bathhouses were common in many towns, and even rural villagers bathed when possible, especially in warmer months. Soap made from animal fat and lye was widely used, and laundry days were part of regular routines. Clothing, though often patched and reused, was washed, aired, and mended. Far from never changing garments, peasants kept what they owned in usable condition. The diet of peasants was also more varied than stereotypes suggest. Bread, porridge, and vegetables formed the base, but gardens provided beans, onions, cabbages, and herbs. Orchards offered apples, pears, and plums. Chickens, goats, and sheep supplied eggs, milk, and wool. On special occasions, meat or fish added variety. While famine and hunger were real dangers in bad years, in ordinary times, peasants ate a diet healthier than the stereotype of endless starvation implies. They worked hard to maintain balance, storing grain for winter, preserving fruits, and sharing resources within the village. Life was certainly laborious. Farming demanded dawn-to-dusk effort, from plowing and sowing to harvesting and storing. Tools were simple plows, hoes, sickles, but used skillfully. They supported entire communities. Seasonal rhythms shaped everything: spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, winter maintenance. But labor did not mean unrelieved misery. Festivals, holy days, and communal gatherings broke the monotony. Villagers celebrated harvests, marked midsummer, and enjoyed fairs. Music, dancing, and storytelling enlivened evenings. Far from being trapped in gloom, peasants found joy and fellowship in their shared world. The stereotype of dirt and misery also ignores the resilience of community ties. Villages were cooperative units where families helped each other build houses, repair tools, and share harvests. Work in the fields was often collective, with neighbors assisting one another at crucial times. Children played together, elders shared knowledge, and families formed networks of support. While hierarchy placed lords above peasants, within the village itself there was solidarity. To survive, people had to work together, and this cooperation fostered bonds that gave meaning to daily life. It is true that poverty was common. Most peasants had little beyond what they needed to survive, and taxes, rents, and obligations too. Landlords could be burdensome. Disease and famine struck hard when they came. But even in hardship, peasants were not passive victims. They developed strategies to endure, storing grain, planting diverse crops, raising animals for trade. They also resisted exploitation when pushed too far. Records of uprisings and protests show that peasants were not powerless. They could and did demand fairer treatment when conditions grew intolerable. The myth of peasants as hopelessly filthy and miserable also overlooks the skill and knowledge they carried. Farming required deep understanding of soil, weather, and crops. Herding demanded skill with animals. Building homes, weaving cloth, brewing ale, making tools, these were crafts, learned and practiced with pride. Far from being ignorant drudges, peasants were experts in the practical arts that sustained their world. Their knowledge of plants, animals, and cycles of nature was hard-won and essential. When we look at art and records from the Middle Ages, we see peasants depicted not only as weary laborers, but also as dancers at festivals, players in village games, and participants in the cycle of the year. Manuscript illustrations show men and women working, yes, but also celebrating harvests, tending gardens, enjoying seasonal feasts. These images remind us that their lives, though hard, were full, with space for joy as well as toil. So why does the myth of muddy misery persist? Because it offers a simple picture of contrast. If the Middle Ages were dirty, dark, and depressing, then everything that came after can be presented as progress. The truth, however, is more balanced. Medieval peasants lived lives of labor, but also of care. Their homes, though modest, were maintained. Their clothing, though simple, was washed and mended. Their food, though plain, was nourishing. Their days, though difficult, were punctuated with laughter, celebration, and love. To see them only as wretched figures in mud is to erase their humanity. They were mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, neighbors and friends. They sang songs, told stories, played games, and dreamed of better harvests. They built villages that endured for generations, and they passed on traditions that shaped Europe's history. They were not trapped in filth. They were builders of communities, survivors of hardship, and people who lived lives richer and more dignified than the myths admit. The peasants in the mud that never was remind us to look more carefully at history. Behind every stereotype lies a more complex reality, one that honors the resilience, skill, and humanity of those who came before. The Middle Ages were not a world of endless misery, but a world of people who worked, laughed, and endured, just as we do today. Few myths about the Middle Ages are as persistent or as unpleasant as the idea that people never bathed, never washed their clothes, and lived surrounded by unbearable filth. Popular imagination paints a picture of peasants and nobles alike, covered in grime, their hair crawling with vermin, their homes stinking with waste, and their streets nothing more than open sewers. In this view, personal hygiene as we know it supposedly did not exist until much later, when modernity finally taught people how to be clean. It is a powerful image, vivid and easy to remember. But like many medieval myths, it is false. The truth is more nuanced, more interesting, and far more human. Medieval people valued cleanliness, practiced hygiene regularly, and created systems to keep themselves and their communities healthy. To begin with, bathing was common. Medieval Europe inherited traditions of bathing from antiquity, and though the great stone bathhouses of Rome had long since fallen into ruin, the custom of bathing continued. In towns and cities across Europe, public bathhouses operated for centuries, providing places where ordinary people could wash, soak, and socialize. Records from Paris, London, Nuremberg, and dozens of other cities describe bathhouses that were part of everyday urban life. In many places, they were as common as bakeries or smithies, and visiting them was a normal habit, not a rare luxury. Families, neighbors, and travelers all used them. Even outside cities, rural villagers bathed. Streams, rivers, ponds, and heated tubs provided ways for people to wash. Seasonal rhythms shaped habits. In warmer months, outdoor washing was frequent, while in colder months, people bathed less often but still washed their hands, faces, and hair. Archaeological finds of wooden tubs and heating devices show how common such practices were. Soap, made from animal fats and lye, was widely used, produced locally, and traded across regions. Far from being strangers to soap, medieval people valued it, used it, and even paid taxes on its sale in some towns. Clothing, too, was kept clean. Laundry was a regular part of household life, often done in rivers or washhouses. Women beat linen against stones, scrubbed it with soap, and hung it to dry in the sun. Texts and illustrations from the period depict laundresses at work, baskets filled with fresh garments. White linen shirts and undergarments, which absorbed sweat and dirt, were washed frequently and changed often. Outer clothing, made of wool, was brushed and aired, not neglected. For wealthier households, laundresses were employed regularly, ensuring garments were fresh. The stereotype that people wore the same filthy clothes for months without change is far from the reality. Hair care and grooming were also part of daily life. Combs made of wood, bone, or ivory are among the most common archaeological finds from medieval sites, showing how widely they were used. People cut their hair, shaved, or trimmed beards, depending on local fashion and social status. Ointments, oils, and herbal rinses were used to clean and freshen hair. Accounts mention scented waters made from rosemary or lavender, applied to give pleasant fragrance. Lice and fleas were problems, as they remained until modern pest control, but they were not ignored. People combed, picked, and washed to control them, just as communities everywhere have always done. Hygiene extended beyond the body to living spaces. Houses were swept, hearths cleaned, rushes or straw on floors were replaced. In towns, regulations required citizens to keep streets in front of their houses clean. Wells were maintained, water channels constructed, and waste was managed through ordinances. Medieval people knew that filth bred illness, even if they did not understand germs in the modern sense. They acted to avoid it, creating rules for where butchers could slaughter animals, where waste could be dumped, and how markets were cleaned. City councils hired officials to monitor cleanliness, and fines were imposed on those who neglected their duty. These measures were imperfect, but they reveal awareness and effort, not indifference. Personal habits also reflected concern for cleanliness. Manuals of manners from the Middle Ages instruct children to wash their hands before meals, to wipe their mouths, to comb their hair, and to avoid offensive smells. Travelers' accounts describe being offered water to wash upon arrival at inns. Ritual hand-washing at banquets was not only symbolic but practical, ensuring diners ate with clean fingers. These customs, repeated across centuries, show that cleanliness was a valued part of social life. The myth of the filthy Middle Ages grew stronger in later centuries, particularly the 19th. Writers eager to depict their own era as advanced exaggerated the dirtiness of the past. They looked back at medieval towns, noted their open sewers and crowded conditions, and assumed that people must have been indifferent to hygiene. They ignored the regulations, customs, and daily practices that prove otherwise. Modern retellings in films and novels often chose the more dramatic picture: peasants covered in muck, nobles perfumed to mask filth, streets filled with refuse. These images stuck because they were shocking and memorable, not because they were true. It is also true that disease struck the Middle Ages harshly, especially during the Great Plagues. The Black Death of the 14th century devastated populations, killing millions across Europe. But disease did not mean that people were dirty or that they never bathed. Even in times of epidemic, people sought remedies, cleaned their homes, and attempted to purify air and water. They lacked modern medicine, but they did not lack effort. To confuse the presence of disease with the absence of hygiene is to misunderstand the past. Bathing itself carried symbolic weight. In chronicles and literature, clean bodies were associated with dignity, order, and respectability. Dirty clothing or neglected grooming was often a sign of poverty, punishment, or disgrace. People aspired to cleanliness because it was socially valued. Public baths, when described, are often bustling with life. Travelers soaking away dust. Merchants discussing business, families sharing relaxation. In some cities, they became centers of leisure, not just necessity. Of course, medieval hygiene was not the same as modern hygiene. There were no showers with running hot water, no antiseptic cleansers, no knowledge of microbes. People bathed less frequently in winter, and waste management in large cities was often overwhelmed. But the idea that they ignored cleanliness entirely is false. They worked with the knowledge and resources they had, and by those standards, they achieved far more than the myth admits. To imagine medieval people as permanently filthy is to strip them of their humanity. They, like us, valued comfort, freshness, and dignity. They washed themselves, cleaned their homes, laundered their clothes, combed their hair, and cared for their appearance. Their world smelled of herbs, soaps, and wood smoke as much as it did of animals or mud. Their communities regulated hygiene just as ours do today. So the next time we hear that medieval people never bathed, let us remember the bathhouses that dotted their towns, the soaps they traded, the laundries by the rivers, the combs in their households, and the rituals of washing that marked daily life. The myth of the filthy Middle Ages is just that, a myth created later, exaggerated for effect, and far removed from the truth of how people actually lived. The Middle Ages were not spotless, but neither were they a swamp of filth. They were a time of people, ordinary, practical, careful people, who sought cleanliness in ways that made sense in their world. And in remembering this, we honor them not as caricatures of dirt, but as humans who, like us, cared about being clean, dignified, and comfortable in the lives they led. When people today imagine the men and women of the Middle Ages, they often picture them as smaller, shorter, and somehow less physically developed than we are now. School books, cartoons, and even casual conversations repeat the idea that medieval peasants were barely taller than children, that knights stood only shoulder high compared to modern soldiers, and that humanity itself has steadily grown taller, stronger, and healthier over time. The picture is dramatic, easy to remember, and fits neatly into the story of progress. The past was stunted, while the present is improved. But once again, this story is misleading. The people of the Middle Ages were not unusually short. They were, on average, similar in height to us today, and their bodies, far from being weak or underdeveloped, were shaped by lives of labor, resilience, and endurance. The myth of medieval shortness has its roots in several misunderstandings. One is the discovery of old doorways and beds in preserved medieval houses that seem smaller than what we are used to. Visitors to ancient cottages often stoop through low door frames or gaze at beds that appear far too short for adults. The natural assumption is that the people who lived there must have been tiny. Yet the explanation lies not in the people, but in the design. Doorways were built lower to conserve heat, since smaller openings kept warm air inside homes during cold winters. Beds, meanwhile, were not always for full stretching sleep. Many people rested in partially upright positions, believing it healthier for digestion, or simply sharing beds with others, curled or angled for space. The furniture was small, but the people were not. Another source of confusion comes from skeletons unearthed in old graves. Archaeologists in earlier centuries sometimes reported that medieval bones were shorter than modern ones, reinforcing the idea of a stunted population. But as methods improved, scholars realized that these measurements had often been flawed. Poor preservation, incomplete remains, or the effects of disease in certain populations skewed the data. Broader and more accurate studies of medieval skeletons have since shown that the average height of men was around 5 feet 7 inches 170 centimeters, and women around 5 feet 2 inches 157 centimeters, figures strikingly close to modern averages. In some regions, such as parts of Scandinavia, men often exceeded 5 feet 9 inches 175 centimeters, as tall as or taller than many men today. It is true that nutrition played a role in variation. In times of famine or poor harvest, children might grow smaller. Their development affected by lack of protein or vitamins. Disease, too, could stunt growth in particular individuals. But these were exceptions, not the rule. In good years, medieval diets provided plenty of calories from bread, grains, beans, vegetables, and dairy. Meat, fish, and eggs added protein. When available, especially for those who lived near rivers, seas, or forests. Far from being universally malnourished, many medieval peasants ate robust diets, sometimes healthier than those of later industrial workers, who often lived on cheap, refined foods. We can see the truth in the very tools and artifacts they left behind. Swords, bows, and armor were built for full-sized adults, not for small people. The length of long bows used by English archers, for example, required tremendous strength and height to handle. The great war horses of knights were bred to carry tall men in armor, not children-sized riders. Clothing found in excavations fits frames of average adult size. When knights were buried in tomb effigies carved in stone, they were shown at life-size proportions. These are not images of undersized figures, but of full-grown men and women whose stature matched ours. The persistence of the myth owes much to the 19th century, when writers and historians eager to portray the Middle Ages as backward exaggerated every possible contrast with their own time. To them, it was convenient to claim that people were shorter, dirtier, and more ignorant, because it made modernity seem like progress by comparison. The idea of short medieval people fit neatly into this narrative, reinforcing the sense that evolution or improvement had gradually lifted humanity from primitive smallness to modern greatness. Yet the reality is that height fluctuates, not across centuries, but across environments. In wealthy, well-fed societies, people are taller. In times of scarcity, they may be shorter. The Middle Ages, with their cycles of feast and famine, reflected this variation, but their averages remained close to ours. When we look at accounts from the time, we find descriptions that make clear people were not unusually small. Chronicles of battles speak of towering knights, of strong warriors, of men whose presence inspired awe. Literature and poetry praise beauty, strength, and stature. Clothing inventories list garments made for men and women of normal adult size. Nothing in these sources suggests that people were dwarfed compared to us. The myth comes not from their world, but from ours. It is also worth noting that many medieval people were physically robust in ways that modern people are not. Labor shaped their bodies from childhood, plowing, carrying water, cutting wood, harvesting crops, riding horses, drawing bows. Strength and stamina were not optional, but essential for survival. The skeletons of archers show enlarged arm bones from years of pulling heavy bows. Farmers' bones show signs of muscle development from endless toil. These were not weak or stunted people, but men and women whose bodies bore the marks of constant use. If anything, many were stronger in daily function than we are today, though they lacked modern medicine to protect them from disease or injury. So why do we cling to the myth of the short medieval person? Perhaps because it is flattering. It makes you feel that history is a story of constant improvement, that we are taller, smarter, and better than those who came before. It fits the narrative of progress that modern societies like to tell, but the truth is more complicated. Humanity has not steadily grown taller over time. Average heights have risen and fallen depending on diet, health, and environment. In some eras, people were taller than in others, but the differences are measured in inches, not feet. Medieval men and women walked streets and fields at heights nearly indistinguishable from ours. When we picture them as tiny, we erase their reality. We shrink them into caricatures, ignoring the evidence of their skeletons, their clothes, their weapons, and their own words. We forget that they were like us, varied in height, some tall, some short, most in between. We forget that their world demanded strength and endurance, not weakness. We forget that they were human beings, not diminished shadows of ourselves. The myth of the short medieval person, like the myth of the flat earth or the immovable night, belongs to the imagination, not to history. The truth is that people of the Middle Ages stood eye to eye with us, worked with bodies shaped by labor, and lived lives full of the same range of stature we see today. To remember this is to restore their dignity, to see them not as curiosities of a lesser age, but as our equals across time. When people today think of medieval meals, the image that often comes to mind is bleak and unappetizing. Bowls of thin gruel, slabs of coarse bread as hard as stone, and endless repetition of bland, colorless stews. According to this picture, peasants gnawed through grain crusts day after day, while nobles gorged themselves on greasy hunks of meat, all without seasoning, balance, or refinement. It is a dramatic picture, useful for films and novels that want to emphasize how far modern cuisine has advanced. Yet, like many stories about the Middle Ages, it is misleading. The food of medieval Europe was more varied, more flavorful, and far more carefully prepared than the myths suggest. That the stereotype of tasteless meals likely comes from two sources. One is the romanticized contrast that later generations wanted to draw between their own civilized dining and the supposed crudity of the past. The other is the survival of some unusual recipes and manuscripts, which modern readers interpret without context. When confronted with instructions for heavily spiced sauces, thickened potages, or unfamiliar combinations of sweet and savory, readers sometimes assume that the food was strange, unpleasant, or designed to mask rottenness. But the truth is that medieval cooks, whether humble villagers or palace chefs, cared deeply about taste, balance, and presentation. At the heart of medieval diets were grains. Bread was indeed central, but not in the coarse, tasteless way often imagined. Makers produced a wide range of breads depending on flour, region, and wealth. White wheat bread was preferred in wealthier households, while rye, barley, and oat loaves were common in rural areas. These breads varied in texture and flavor, with some enriched by honey or herbs. Far from being uniform blocks, they formed the staple of meals that were hearty and sustaining. Soups and stews, another staple, were not bland mixtures, but often seasoned with herbs and vegetables. Onions, leeks, parsley, sage, dill, and garlic-flavored pots simmering over hearth fires. In regions with access to trade, imported spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and saffron transformed dishes into fragrant meals. Even in villages far from trade routes, gardens supplied flavor. Mint for freshness, thyme for depth, marjoram for warmth. Families passed down knowledge of how to season foods, and cooks were judged by their skill in making ordinary ingredients taste special. Meat, while not eaten daily by peasants, played a role in many diets. Chickens, goats, and sheep provided occasional meals, while nobles hunted deer, boar, and game birds. Preservation methods like salting, smoking, and drying ensured that meat could last through winter. Fish, both freshwater and saltwater, were widely consumed, particularly in regions with rivers and coasts. Far from being a monotonous diet, medieval Europe knew countless varieties of fish, from eels and herring to trout and sturgeon. Preparation methods ranged from roasting and boiling to frying and baking, with sauces adding richness and complexity. Dairy was another essential part of the diet. Milk from cows, goats, and sheep was consumed fresh or turned into butter and cheese. Cheese making was widespread, producing varieties from soft curds to aged wheels, butter-flavored dishes, and enriched bread. These products provided fat and protein, ensuring balance in everyday meals. Vegetables and fruits played a greater role than the stereotype allows. Gardens yielded beans, peas, cabbage, carrots, onions, turnips, and leafy greens. Orchards provided apples, pears, plums, and cherries. Berries grew wild in woods and hedges. Fruits were eaten fresh, dried for winter, or cooked into pies and sauces. Nuts, including hazelnuts and walnuts, added both flavor and nutrition. The idea that medieval diets lacked fruits and vegetables is simply untrue. These foods were integral to daily life. Spices deserve special attention, for they are often misunderstood. Modern retellings sometimes claim that medieval people used spices to cover the taste of rotten meat. This is a myth. Meat was expensive, and no one would waste costly spices on food that was spoiled. Spices were a luxury prized for their flavor, fragrance, and symbolic value. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves, and saffron were imported from distant lands and treasured in kitchens. Their use reflected status, but also a sophisticated palate. Medieval cooks combined spices with local herbs, creating layers of flavor that modern palates often underestimate. Nobles and royals employed professional chefs who developed complex recipes. Manuscripts from the period contain instructions for sauces with wine, vinegar, and spices for roasts, basted with herbs, for pastries filled with fruit and nuts. Presentation mattered. Food was colored with saffron, spinach, or beet juice to delight the eye. Sugar, another luxury, was shaped into sculptures for feasts. Banquets were not crude affairs, but elaborate displays of artistry, where dishes were chosen to impress guests with both taste and appearance. Even among peasants, meals carried care. Families seasoned stews with what they had, shared bread still, warm from village ovens, and flavored porridges with honey when possible. Seasonal cycles meant variety, fresh greens in spring, berries in summer, apples in autumn, stored grains, and salted fish in winter. The rhythm of the year ensured that meals changed, reflecting what the land offered at each stage. Eating was not monotonous survival, but a balance of resourcefulness and tradition. Drinks, too, added flavor. Ale, beer, cider, and wine were widely consumed not as luxuries but as everyday staples, since clean water was not always reliable. These drinks varied in strength and flavor, with herbs sometimes added. They accompanied meals as part of ordinary life, brewed in households and monasteries. Alike, it is true that diets varied by wealth. Nobles had access to exotic spices, large quantities of meat, and imported luxuries. Peasants lived more modestly, relying on bread, vegetables, and dairy, with meat or fish as occasional additions. Yet within their means all sought flavor, nourishment, and enjoyment. Meals were social occasions, shared with family and neighbors, enlivened by conversation, music, and celebration. The myth of tasteless food also ignores the role of medicine and philosophy in cooking. Medieval scholars believed in balancing the humors of the body hot, cold, wet, and dry through diet. Cooks considered not only taste but also the supposed health effects of ingredients. Recipes aimed to create harmony between flavor and well-being. This system may not align with modern nutrition, but it shows a concern for thoughtful preparation, not random mixtures. Evidence from archaeology confirms the richness of medieval food culture. Remains of spices have been found in port cities, charred grains in village hearths, fish bones in inland settlements far from the sea. Pollen analysis reveals orchards and gardens tended with care. Cookware, from pots to spits to baking ovens, demonstrates a variety of techniques. These finds speak of people who cooked, experimented, and enjoyed their meals. So why does the myth of tasteless medieval food persist? Perhaps because it makes for a good contrast. Modern cuisine with its global ingredients and refined techniques appears more advanced when compared to a caricature of endless rule. Popular media prefers the image of peasants gnawing on hard bread and nobles feasting crudely because it is easy, dramatic, and simple. The truth that medieval food was diverse, seasoned, and thoughtfully prepared requires more explanation. But it also offers more respect to the people who lived then. The reality is that medieval meals were not dreary. They were shaped by seasons, enriched by herbs and spices, enlivened by fruits and nuts, balanced by bread and dairy. They carried meaning beyond survival, linking families, communities, and traditions. To dismiss them as tasteless is to ignore the creativity and care of generations who cooked with what they had and made it into something meaningful. The myth of flavorless food, like so many others, tells us more about how later ages viewed the past than about the past itself. When we look closer, we find not misery, but ingenuity, not blandness, but variety, not survival alone, but enjoyment. Medieval people ate with taste, with thought, and with pleasure. And in remembering this, we bring them closer to ourselves, not as strange figures from a tasteless age, but as humans who, like us, cherished good food, good company, and the comfort of a well-prepared meal. When people today imagine the Middle Ages, one of the most persistent and disturbing images is that of torture chambers lurking beneath castles, dungeons filled with prisoners, and executioners constantly inventing new ways to cause pain. Popular films and novels often linger on iron maidens, racks, and spiked chairs, giving the impression that medieval life was defined by cruelty, that ordinary people lived under the constant threat of horrific punishment. According to this view, the period was not simply an age of faith or farming, but a theater of violence, where every town square was the stage for gruesome spectacles. It is an image so dramatic that it has overshadowed reality. But the truth is more complex, more ordinary, and far less saturated with torture than the myths suggest. There is no denying that the Middle Ages knew violence. Wars, feuds, and executions were part of life, as they have been in many societies across history. But the idea that torture was a constant, daily part of justice, or that medieval people delighted in cruelty, exaggerates the truth. In fact, legal systems of the time were more structured, punishments more varied, and the supposed torture devices we so often hear about are in many cases inventions of later centuries. Consider first the notorious Iron Maiden, the spiked sarcophagus into which victims were supposedly locked until death. It appears in countless horror stories of the Dark Ages, yet there is no reliable evidence of its use in medieval Europe. The earliest references to such a device come from the 16th century, long after the Middle Ages, and even then, they appear more in sensational writings than in practice. Museums that displayed Iron Maidens in the 19th century often assembled them from unrelated parts to thrill visitors. The image of the Iron Maiden as a medieval instrument is a creation of later imagination, not a tool of medieval justice. Other devices, like spiked wheels and crushing boots, also owe much to myth. Some were real, but rare. Others were exaggerations of punishments described in texts. The rack, for example, did exist, but its use was far less widespread than modern portrayals suggest. Most medieval courts preferred fines, exile, public penance, or imprisonment to elaborate tortures. Executions, when carried out, were usually swift by hanging, beheading, or burning, not prolonged exhibitions of suffering. The elaborate tortures imagined today were exceptions, not the rule. What did everyday justice actually look like? In most villages and towns, disputes were settled locally by lords, councils, or assemblies. Minor crimes often brought fines, restitution, or community service. A thief might be required to return stolen goods and pay compensation. A drunkard might be placed in the stocks for a few hours of public embarrassment. A quarrel could be resolved by mediation or sworn oaths. Only in serious cases, murder, treason, repeated offenses, did harsher penalties appear. And even then, records show a surprising emphasis on restoring order rather than inflicting spectacle. Torture, as an investigative tool, did exist in some courts, especially in continental Europe, but it was carefully regulated. It was not a daily occurrence, nor was it used on every suspect. Courts often required that confessions obtained under torture be confirmed by other evidence. In some places, torture could only be authorized by higher authorities and used under specific circumstances. This does not excuse its cruelty, but it does reveal that it was not an unchecked frenzy of violence. It was bounded, debated, and often resisted. Even in its own time, the myth of endless torture also ignores the fact that prisons, while present, were not the vast dungeons of film. Many were simple holding cells attached to town halls or castles where suspects awaited trial or punishment. Long-term imprisonment was relatively rare, as it was costly to feed prisoners. Communities preferred to resolve cases quickly, with penalties that restored order and reduced expense. The dungeon filled with hundreds of screaming captives is a fantasy, not a historical norm. So why do we think otherwise? Much of the blame lies with later centuries, particularly the Renaissance and Enlightenment, which sought to define themselves against a barbarous Middle Ages. Writers exaggerated medieval cruelty to to make their own reforms look more enlightened. They described torture devices in lurid detail, sometimes inventing them outright. In the 19th century, with the rise of sensational literature and Gothic revival, stories of dungeons and iron maidens thrilled readers and museum goers. These myths entered popular imagination, where they remain today. Art and entertainment reinforce the image. Painters depicted grim scenes of medieval punishment. Novelists filled castles with secret chambers. Filmmakers added the creak of chains and the scream of victims to every medieval setting. The result is that we remember the Middle Ages not for its communities, its festivals, or its ordinary justice, but for the darkest possible images of cruelty. This tells us more about modern taste for drama than about medieval reality. When we look at surviving records from medieval towns, we see something very different from endless torture. We see lists of fines for disorderly conduct, of disputes over property, of conflicts resolved by arbitration. We see community justice in action, designed to keep peace in small villages where everyone knew each other. The constant threat of torture chambers simply does not appear in these records. What appears is the normal rhythm of law, messy, imperfect, sometimes harsh, but rarely the theater of horror imagined later. Even executions, though undeniably public and intended as deterrents, were less frequent than often supposed. Many crimes resulted in non-lethal penalties. Public shaming, such as time in the pillory or stocks, was common. These punishments were humiliating, but not designed to inflict lasting harm. Communities valued deterrence and restoration more than constant bloodshed. This is not to deny that violence existed. Wars ravaged lands, feuds claimed lives, and brutal punishments were carried out in certain cases. But to imagine the entire Middle Ages as an age of endless torture is to mistake part for whole. For most people, most of the time, daily life was defined not by dungeons and racks, but by farming, trade, family, and community. The myth of universal cruelty erases the ordinariness of their lives and reduces them to caricatures of suffering. The fascination with medieval torture tells us something important, not about them, but about us. We enjoy stories of extremes, of fear, of horror. We build myths of the past that confirm our sense of superiority. By imagining medieval people as brutal and ignorant, we make ourselves feel more advanced, more humane, more civilized. But history is rarely so simple. The people of the Middle Ages lived in societies with rules, customs, and justice systems that sought order, not chaos. Torture was not their daily reality, but our inherited myth. To understand the Middle Ages fairly, we must look past the iron, maidens of imagination, and the dungeons of fiction. We must remember that communities strove to maintain peace, that justice included compromise as well as punishment, and that cruelty, while present, was not the essence of their world. The myth of endless medieval torture belongs more to Gothic novels and museum curiosities than to the lives of real men and women who tilled fields, raised children, and sought stability. In the end, the Middle Ages were not an age of perpetual horror, but an age of people ordinary, flawed, resilient people who lived under laws, settled disputes, and endured hardships without the constant shadow of invented machines of pain. The racks and iron maidens that fill our imagination are echoes of later centuries, not of theirs. The truth, once again, is quieter, more complex, and far more human than the myth. When people today think of women in the Middle Ages, the image that often emerges is one of silence, oppression, and invisibility. According to this popular view, women were little more than property, passed from father to husband, denied education, and excluded from meaningful roles in society. Stories and films depict them as helpless figures locked in towers, peasants bent over endless labor, or background characters in a world ruled entirely by men. The impression is stark, medieval. Women supposedly had no rights, no power, and no agency. Yet this picture is incomplete, simplified, and distorted by later stereotypes. While it is true that medieval society was patriarchal and women faced many restrictions, the reality of their lives was far richer, more varied, and more influential than the myth allows. Evidence from every level of society shows that women played essential roles, exercised authority, and shaped the world around them. Far from being powerless, they were landowners, merchants, craftswomen, healers, writers, and rulers. They were present in fields and markets, in households and courts, in towns and villages. They managed property, defended rights, and, in some cases, commanded armies. Their lives were not easy, and equality, as we understand it today, did not exist. But to erase their presence is to erase half of medieval humanity. For ordinary women, life was rooted in work. Peasant women labored alongside men in the fields, planting, harvesting, and tending animals. They spun thread, wove cloth, brewed ale, baked bread, and cared for children. Household management required skill and organization, from storing grain to preserving food for winter. In many villages, women contributed as much to survival as men, their labor indispensable to the community. Records of manorial courts show women suing neighbors, defending property boundaries, and testifying in disputes. They were not voiceless. They participated in the systems that governed their lives. In towns and cities, women engaged in trade and crafts. Widows often inherited their husbands' workshops, continuing businesses as tailors, bakers, brewers, or innkeepers. Some became independent entrepreneurs, employing apprentices and managing accounts. Guild records list female members, and tax rolls record women paying dues as citizens. In markets, women bought and sold goods, negotiated prices, and shaped urban economies. Far from being confined to homes, they were visible participants in daily commerce. Education, too, was not absent. While fewer women than men received formal schooling, opportunities did exist. Noble women often learned to read, write, and manage estates. Some became renowned writers, such as Christine de Pizan in the 15th century, whose Book of the City of Ladies defended women's intelligence and contributions. In convents, women studied Latin, copied manuscripts, and composed poetry and music. Female scholars debated philosophy, advised rulers, and corresponded with intellectuals. Literacy rates were lower for women overall, but those who were educated left works that proved their voices were not silent. Marriage shaped many women's lives, but even here their agency was greater than stereotypes suggest. While arranged marriages were common among the nobility, many women, especially in towns and villages, chose their partners. Legal records show women entering contracts, receiving dowries, and negotiating terms. Widows, in particular, often enjoyed significant independence, controlling property and making decisions without male guardians. In some regions, widows could head households, run farms, and serve as legal guardians of children. At the highest levels of society, women wielded extraordinary power. Queens and noblewomen acted as regents, ruling in the absence of kings. Eleanor of Aquitaine governed vast lands, influenced politics across France and England, and even participated in military campaigns. Isabella of France and Margaret of Denmark played decisive roles in statecraft. In certain city-states, women ruled in their own right or co-ruled with husbands. Their signatures appear on treaties, charters, and decrees. These examples were not the norm for all women, but they demonstrate that medieval gender roles were not absolute barriers. Law, while often unequal, did grant women recognized rights. They could inherit property, though sometimes with limitations. They could enter contracts, sue in courts, and defend themselves in disputes. Dowries gave them economic standing, and in many regions they controlled their own movable goods. Legal texts may have favored men, but women's presence in court records shows they were active participants in justice. The myth of the powerless medieval woman owes much to later centuries. In the 19th century, when romantic images of knights and damsels in distress became popular, literature and art depicted women as helpless figures waiting to be rescued. This image stuck, reinforcing stereotypes of passive femininity. In reality, medieval women were active, resilient, and adaptable. They worked, managed, created, and ruled. Of course, their lives were not free of hardship. Childbirth was dangerous, mortality rates were high, and patriarchal structures often restricted freedom. Women's voices were sometimes dismissed, their opportunities limited compared to men's, but the idea that they were entirely powerless erases the nuance of history. Power existed on a spectrum, and within the constraints of their time, many women found ways to assert agency, influence families, and shape communities. Archaeology and written records both confirm this fuller picture. Excavations of medieval towns reveal tools, looms, and cooking equipment that testify to women's work. Manuscripts preserve the writings of female poets and scholars. Legal charters record women's names as witnesses and benefactors. Tomb effigies depict women with dignity, sometimes shown with books or symbols of authority. These fragments, taken together, dismantle the myth of invisibility. The truth is that medieval women were present at every level of society. They tilled fields, spun cloth, sold goods, healed the sick, copied books, composed songs, governed estates, and, in some cases, directed kingdoms. They were not equal to men by law or custom, but they were far from powerless. To imagine them as silent shadows is to deny their resilience, their contributions, and their humanity. The myth of the powerless medieval woman, like so many other myths, survives because it is simple, dramatic, and easy to tell. But reality is always more complex. Women of the Middle Ages lived full lives, balancing constraints with agency, facing hardships, but also creating legacies. Their stories remind us that even in times when structures favored men, women found ways to shape their world. They remind youth that history is never the story of one gender alone, but of all humanity. working together to survive, to build, and to endure. Among the most persistent and gloomy myths about the Middle Ages is the belief that most people never lived past the age of 30. School lessons and casual conversations often present the period as one of relentless short lives, where gray hair was unknown and grandparents were a rarity. According to this myth, life was brutal and brief, with men and women doomed to early graves long before they had the chance to grow old. This impression is dramatic, easy to grasp, and feeds the story of progress that only in modern times have people lived to see old age. Yet the reality is very different. While life expectancy in the Middle Ages was indeed lower than today, this was not because everyone died young. Instead, it was the result of high infant mortality pulling down the average. For those who survived childhood, living into their 50s, 60s, or beyond was not uncommon at all. The statistics that mislead us come from how averages are calculated. If you take a community where many children die before the age of 5, the average lifespan appears short, even if many adults live long lives. For example, imagine 10 people. 5 die as infants, while the other 5 live to 60. The average lifespan is only 30 years, yet half the group reached what we would call old age. This is exactly the case in medieval Europe. Disease, malnutrition, and limited medicine meant that childhood was perilous, but survival past those fragile years often led to decades more of life. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries show many individuals with signs of advanced age, worn teeth, healed bones, and joints marked by arthritis. Written records mention elders participating in village councils, managing estates, and guiding families. Chronicles describe leaders, scholars, and peasants alike living into their 60s and 70s. Old age was not the majority's fate, but it was not rare either. Grandparents existed, and many families had living connections across 3 or 4 generations. Consider the lives of well-known medieval figures. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived into her 80s, shaping European politics across 2 generations. Hildegard of Bingen composed music and wrote treatises into her 70s. Even among ordinary folk, there are records of villagers still working land or drawing pensions in their 60s. These examples show that while disease and war cut many lives short, old age remained a visible and respected part of medieval society. Part of the myth of the 30-year life comes from our habit of generalizing. When we hear average lifespan, 30 years, we imagine every individual dying at 30. But averages hide variation. In the Middle Ages, many infants died within their first years, but those who survived often lived far longer. A boy who reached adolescence could expect decades of adulthood. A girl who lived through the risks of childbirth could grow old among her grandchildren. In this way, medieval lifespans were not as alien to ours as the myth suggests. Daily life also included attention to health. People valued balanced diets, exercise through labor, and relied on herbal remedies. While they lacked modern medicine, they observed the effects of food, rest, and cleanliness on well-being. Communities supported elders, who were honored for wisdom and experience. Proverbs and literature of the time often referenced old age, showing that it was a familiar stage of life, not an unheard of rarity. The myth of universal short lives also thrives because it is dramatic. It makes the past seem harsher, darker, and more distant. It reinforces the sense that modernity has rescued us from misery. But the truth is subtler. The Middle Ages were difficult, yes, but not devoid of long lives. Human resilience, family. Care and simple good fortune often carried people well beyond 30. It is important to recognize, too, that old age in the Middle Ages carried social weight. Elders managed property, advised younger generations, and preserved memory. In villages, older men and women often served as arbiters in disputes or keepers of tradition. Their experience was valued, their presence respected. This would not have been possible if no one lived past 30. The persistence of the myth also speaks to our tendency to underestimate the past. By imagining medieval people as doomed to short lives, we place ourselves on a pedestal, convincing ourselves that progress has made us not only smarter and cleaner, but longer lived. The truth, however, shows continuity as well as change. Medicine, sanitation, and nutrition have indeed extended average lifespans dramatically, but the existence of old age is not new. Medieval people knew it, lived it, and prepared for it. Next time we hear that no one lived past 30 in the Middle Ages, it is worth remembering the grandparents and village records, the noblewomen who outlived their husbands and children, the farmers who worked fields into their twilight years. It is worth remembering that cemeteries contain not only the graves of infants and warriors, but of elders who bore the marks of long labor and long life. The myth of the 30-year life belongs to careless averages, not to reality. In truth, medieval life was neither a fleeting 30 years nor a hopeless march to early death. It was a span of risks and resilience, of short lives and long ones, of children lost too soon, but also of elders who carried memory across generations. The Middle Ages were not devoid of old age. They were full of people living as long as circumstance allowed, sometimes short, often long, always human. Few phrases are as enduring or as misleading as the Dark Ages. For centuries, people have used it to describe the Middle Ages as an era of ignorance, stagnation, and despair, when nothing of value was created and all progress supposedly ceased until the Renaissance burst forth with light. School lessons, novels, and films reinforce this impression, painting medieval Europe as a place of superstition and violence, devoid of science, art, or learning. According to this view, it was 1,000 years of darkness wedged between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of modernity. Yet, as with so many myths about the Middle Ages, this one tells us more about the prejudices of later centuries than about the period itself. The Middle Ages were not an age of pure darkness. They were an era of creativity, adaptation, discovery, and transformation, full of achievements that laid the foundations of the world we know today. The very phrase, Dark Ages, was coined long after the fact. Renaissance writers in the 14th and 15th centuries, eager to celebrate their own era, looked back at the centuries before them and dismissed them as barren. To make their own art, science, and humanism shine brighter, they cast the Middle Ages as shadow. Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century repeated the insult, contrasting reason and progress with what they imagined as centuries of ignorance. By the 19th century, the phrase had become common shorthand in textbooks, and it remains in popular speech today. But historians now recognize that this label is unfair, simplistic, and profoundly inaccurate. Far from being a time without learning, the Middle Ages fostered knowledge in countless ways. Universities were founded in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Salamanca, institutions that survive today as some of the world's oldest centers of education. These universities taught logic, medicine, law, and philosophy, producing scholars who debated and recorded ideas with rigor. Libraries accumulated manuscripts, preserving not only ancient Greek and Roman works, but also creating new treatises that advanced thought in their own right. The myth that medieval people never studied science collapses when we recall figures like Roger Bacon, who experimented with optics, or Albertus Magnus, who cataloged plants and minerals, or countless anonymous clerks who copied, translated, and commented on texts that would otherwise have vanished. Technology, too, advanced steadily. The heavy plow transformed European agriculture, allowing farmers to cultivate rich northern soils. The horse collar and horseshoe increased efficiency in transportation and farming. Windmills and water mills multiplied, grinding grain, pumping water, and powering hammers. The mechanical clock, invented in the late Middle Ages, changed how people experienced time, structuring both daily life and long-term planning. Eyeglasses extended vision. Paper spread literacy. Improved ship design opened the way for exploration. These were not the creations of a stagnant society, but of inventive minds meeting practical challenges with ingenuity. Art and architecture flourished as well. Far from producing nothing, the Middle Ages gave us soaring Gothic cathedrals with stained glass that turned sunlight into jeweled light and stone vaults that lifted eyes toward heaven. Illuminated manuscripts glowed with color and gold, filling pages with intricate designs and detailed miniatures. Music evolved from simple chants into polyphony, a foundation for the symphonies that would follow centuries later. Literature blossomed in vernacular languages. Dante in Italian, Chaucer in English, Cervantes' predecessors in Spanish. These works were not shadows. They were beams of brilliance that still illuminate world culture. Medicine, often caricatured as nothing more than superstition, contained a blend of observation, tradition, and experimentation. Physicians studied texts from ancient Greece and the Islamic world, applied herbal remedies, and developed practices of surgery and diagnosis. While limited by the knowledge of the time, they cared for patients with seriousness and sought to understand the causes of illness. Apothecaries prepared treatments, midwives guided childbirth, and healers passed on practical remedies. Medieval medicine was imperfect, but it was not ignorance. It was the best attempt of the time to ease suffering and prolong life. Trade networks connected distant regions, carrying goods, ideas, and technologies across continents. Silk and spices traveled from Asia. Wool and wine moved across Europe. Gold and ivory arrived from Africa. Merchants gathered in fairs and markets, forging ties that shaped economies. Towns grew into bustling centers of commerce, with guilds, regulating crafts and apprenticeships, training new generations. Banking developed, credit expanded, and letters of exchange allowed money to move safely across long distances. These were not the marks of stagnation, but of vibrant economic life. Science, too, moved forward. Astronomy advanced through careful observation. Mathematics expanded with the introduction of Arabic numerals, which revolutionized calculation. Navigation improved with the compass and more accurate maps. The myth that medieval people thought the earth was flat is one of many falsehoods that obscure their true knowledge. They studied the stars, calculated planetary movements, and debated natural philosophy with vigor. Their questions may have been framed differently than ours, but their curiosity was genuine and their methods increasingly systematic. The myth of the Dark Ages persists partly because later eras preferred to see themselves as more enlightened. It is easier to claim brilliance when contrasting oneself with supposed darkness. It is also because the Middle Ages, like all eras, contained real hardship, wars, plagues, and famines that left deep scars. But hardship is not the same as ignorance. The Black Death was catastrophic, yet even amid devastation, communities rebuilt, medicine adapted, and economies recovered. Violence was real, yet alongside it were treaties, laws, and customs that stabilized societies. Darkness and light were, mixed as they are in every age. Ordinary life in the Middle Ages was not lived in shadows. Farmers sowed and harvested. Families raised children. Communities celebrated festivals with song, dance, and feasting. Craftsmen carved wood, shaped metal, and wove cloth with artistry. Women managed households, traded goods, and in some cases, ruled estates. Children learned games, stories, and prayers. Villages and towns buzzed with ordinary routines, filled not with despair but with the same mixture of labor and joy that characterizes human life in any era. The label of darkness not only misleads but also insults the countless people who lived, worked, and created during those centuries. It reduces their achievements to nothing, erasing their contributions to our world. Without their mills, their plows, their manuscripts, their universities, and their ships, the Renaissance itself would not have been possible. The so-called light of later centuries was built on the steady work of medieval generations. Archaeology and scholarship continue to dismantle the myth. Excavations uncover thriving towns, sophisticated tools, and evidence of trade across continents. Manuscripts reveal intellectual debates and scientific notes. Surviving structures, bridges, cathedrals, castles demonstrate skill and vision. The more we study, the clearer it becomes that the Middle Ages were not darkness, but a chapter of transition. Creativity and endurance. To see them only as dark is to miss their humanity. It is to overlook the laughter of festivals, the pride of craftsmen, the wisdom of elders, and the daring of explorers. It is to ignore the resilience of communities that faced challenges with resourcefulness. It is to forget that they, like us, lived full lives of hope and fear, labor and love. The myth of the Dark Ages, like so many myths, survives because it is simple, dramatic, and flattering to modern pride. But the truth is richer, more complex, and far more admirable. The Middle Ages were not 1,000 years of ignorance. They were centuries of effort, creation, and quiet brilliance. They were the time in which Europe transformed from the ruins of empire into the roots of modern states, economies, and cultures. They were not dark, but full of light, sometimes dim, sometimes flickering, but always present. In remembering this, we honor the people of that age, not as caricatures lost in shadow, but as ancestors whose work, thought, and creativity shaped the very world we inhabit. The darkness was never absolute. The Middle Ages, like all eras, were filled with both struggles and achievements. To call them dark is to close our eyes. To study them fairly is to open them again and see the light. They carried forward